He walked through the office doors at 9:47 a.m. on my very first day, looked across the floor, and said who authorized this hire, then told my manager to clear my desk by noon, not knowing he had just handed the one person trained to find his fraud a reason to look. He did not even learn my name first. That is the part that still sits with me, not with bitterness anymore, just with the specific clarity of someone who has had enough time to understand exactly what she walked into and exactly what she walked out of. He came through the glass doors of that office at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, the first Tuesday of my entire professional life, and he looked across the open floor plan with the expression of a man who has never once in his adult life questioned whether a room wanted him in it, and his eyes landed on me, the new person, the one who did not yet know where the bathroom was or how to work the coffee machine or which of the 12 people who had smiled at me during orientation actually meant it, and he said, in a voice that required no effort to carry across the entire floor, "Who authorized this hire?" Not a question. A verdict. The floor went silent the way floors go silent when the person with the most power in the building decides to use it publicly. I felt 30 pairs of eyes do that thing where they want to look at you and also desperately do not want to be caught looking at you. My manager, a woman named Sandra who had interviewed me 3 times and called my references and sent me a welcome email with a gif of confetti in it, stood up from her desk with the careful body language of someone who has been in this position before and has learned the specific posture that minimizes damage. She said, "I did. She comes highly recommended. Her background in financial compliance is exactly what the audit team needs and..." He said, "Clear her desk." Sandra said, "Marcus." He said, "Today." Then he walked into his glass corner office and closed the door and picked up his phone, and the floor slowly, painfully, returned to the performance of a normal Tuesday morning while I stood next to a desk I had put exactly 3 things on: a succulent, a notepad, and a coffee mug my roommate had given me as a first-day gift, and understood that I had just been fired in front of approximately 30 people for a reason that had not been stated and possibly did not exist. I was 26 years old. I had worked toward that job for 2 years. The salary was the first salary I had ever been offered that made me feel like the math of my life was going to start working in my direction. I had signed a lease on an apartment 3 weeks earlier based on that salary. I had told my mother, who had cleaned office buildings for most of my childhood so that I could go to a university she could not afford and pursue a career she had not had access to, that things were finally, genuinely, moving. I sat down in my chair. I picked up my succulent. I looked at the notepad and the coffee mug and I thought, do I take these now or do I wait to be escorted out? Which is a thing I had read about in the context of financial firms and never imagined applying to the first 2 hours of my first real job. Sandra came to my desk. She crouched down so she was at eye level with me, which I understood was an act of deliberate dignity on her part. She was refusing to stand over me in this, and she said very quietly that she was sorry, that this was not a reflection of anything I had done, that Marcus had moods that arrived without warning and departed the same way, and that she was going to fight this through HR and she needed me to go home for now and she would call me by end of day. She called me by end of day. She told me HR had confirmed the termination. She sounded genuinely distressed. She said she was going to do everything she could. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my new apartment that I now had no income to support and looked at my succulent and thought about calling my mother and could not make myself do it yet. I need to tell you about Marcus Hale before I tell you what happened next, because understanding what happened next requires understanding what kind of man he was, and what kind of man he was is the kind that accumulates power in a specific way, loudly and quickly, in a direction, through a combination of genuine intelligence and complete ruthlessness and a fundamental belief that the rules that govern other people are a kind of weather system he has simply learned to move through faster than everyone else. He had founded the company, Hale Financial Consulting, 7 years before that Tuesday. Started it with 2 people in a shared office space and scaled it to 60 employees and a client portfolio that managed north of $300 million in assets for a specific tier of high net worth individuals who wanted aggressive returns and were willing to pay for the kind of access and discretion that Marcus had built a reputation for providing. He was 38. He had been in 2 financial publications in the past year. He drove a car that cost more than most people's annual salaries and wore it with the ease of someone who has never had to think about whether he could afford something. He was also, and this is the part that was visible if you were positioned to see it, which most people in that building were not because proximity to power creates its own particular blindness, operating with a looseness around the edges of regulatory compliance that a person with my specific background and my specific training would have been positioned to notice immediately. I did not know that on my first day. I did not know it when he fired me. I'm telling you now because it is the architecture of everything that came after, and the architecture matters. Sandra called me 4 days after the firing with a different kind of voice. Less distressed, more careful, the voice of someone who has learned something and is choosing each word with awareness of its weight. She asked if I was available to meet for coffee, not at the office, somewhere neutral. I said yes because Sandra had been kind to me and also because I had nothing else scheduled for the foreseeable future. She told me, over coffee at a place 3 blocks from the office, that Marcus had fired me specifically because I had been hired for the audit compliance role. That the audit compliance role had been Sandra's initiative, built over months of lobbying for it, and that Marcus had apparently been unaware of the specific scope of the position until the paperwork crossed his desk that morning. That the scope of the position included access to internal financial records at a depth that other roles at the company did not have. She said, he did not want that access to exist. I did not understand why until 3 days ago. She looked at her coffee for a moment. She said, I think you need to know what I know. And I think you need to decide what you do with it. She had not gone looking for what she found. She had gone looking for documentation to support her HR case for my reinstatement, and what she had found instead, and files she had legitimate access to as a senior manager, was a pattern. A pattern in the movement of client funds that did not match the statements being sent to those clients. Differences that were individually small enough to be attributable to fees or timing or rounding, but that were consistent in a direction, and that added up, across accounts and across time, to a number that Sandra had written on a piece of paper and slid across the table to me. I looked at the number. I said, how long? She said, at least 3 years based on what I can see. Possibly longer. I said, does anyone else know? She said, his assistant figured something out yesterday. She does not know the full picture, but she knows enough to be frightened. She came to me this morning. I said, what does she know? She said, that transfers are moving that she did not schedule. That amounts are different from what she logged. That when she asked about one of them, she was told very clearly and very quietly to log it as a client fee adjustment and not ask again. I sat with my coffee getting cold in front of me, and I thought about a lot of things simultaneously. I thought about my lease. I thought about my mother. I thought about Marcus Hale looking across a floor of 30 people and deciding I was a problem to be removed before I started, and how that decision, meant to protect him, had instead placed me directly outside the situation with full information and no loyalty to preserve. He had fired the one person who would have found it from the inside. And then told her exactly why by the method of the firing. That was the mistake. Not hiring me. Firing me the way he did, in front of Sandra, who then fought for my reinstatement and dug into the documentation to build her case. He had tried to close a window and instead had opened a door. I asked Sandra what she wanted to do. She said, I want to do what is right. But I need to know you are with me because I cannot do this alone and I cannot do it quietly. I need someone who understands what they are looking at when they look at these numbers. I looked at her across the table. She was a woman who had hired me carefully and fought for me immediately and was now sitting in a coffee shop having a conversation that was going to change the shape of her professional life regardless of how it ended, and she was having it anyway, and that told me everything I needed to know about her. I said, tell me everything you have. She told me everything she had. We sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours. I want to be precise about what we did and did not do, because this part of the story has a shape that people sometimes want to make more dramatic than it was, and the reality was not dramatic. It was methodical. It was careful. It was 2 women sitting across a kitchen table, and then a dining room table, and then eventually a conference room table, going through documents with the specific patience of people who understand that if you are going to build something that will hold, you build it correctly. Sandra had access. That was the foundation. Her role gave her legitimate access to the internal financial management system, to client account records, to transfer documentation going back several years. She was not hacking anything. She was reading files she was authorized to read, and what she was reading, once you knew what you were looking for, told a story that was not subtle. It had been subtle once, probably, in the early days when the amounts were smaller and the frequency was lower, but success had made Marcus careless in the way it makes certain people careless, where the absence of consequences starts to feel like the absence of risk, and he had scaled the operation with the same confidence he brought to everything, which was the confidence of a man who has never seriously believed he would be stopped. The pattern was client funds being skimmed at the point of reinvestment. A client would authorize a transfer of, say, $200,000 into a particular fund. The transfer would be logged at $200,000. The fund would receive $187,000. The difference would move through a sequence of internal accounts, not quickly enough to trigger automated flagging, and eventually arrive somewhere that was not the client's portfolio and was not the firm's operating account. 3 years of that, across 60 clients, in amounts that ranged from thousands to hundreds of thousands, added up to the number Sandra had written on the piece of paper and slid across the coffee shop table. The number was significant enough that I understood why he had looked across a room on a Tuesday morning and decided that an audit compliance specialist was a person who needed to be gone before lunch. The assistant's name was Rachel. She was 24 and had been in the role for 8 months and had the particular wariness of someone who has recently understood that the environment she works in is not what it presented as during the interview. She came to me through Sandra, sat in Sandra's living room on a Thursday evening, and told me what she had seen in language that was careful and frightened and precise. She was not confused about what she had witnessed. She had asked about one transfer, been told to reclassify it and not ask again, and had gone home that night and taken a screenshot of everything she could access from her phone before she was locked out of anything. The screenshot was on her phone. She showed it to me. It showed what she had described. I said, "Have you told anyone else?" She said, "I told my boyfriend. He told me to quit and not look back." I said, "That is reasonable advice and I understand why he gave it." She said, "I'm not going to do that." I said, "I know. Otherwise you would not be here." She looked at me with the expression of someone deciding whether to trust something, and then she said, "He fired you on your first day because of what you might find. Does that make you angry?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. Me too." We filed the regulatory complaint together, Sandra and Rachel and I, through the proper channel, which was the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower program, which exists for exactly this circumstance and which has, for people who use it correctly, specific legal protections attached. We used an attorney. Sandra found her through a referral, a woman named Patricia who specialized in financial whistleblower cases and who sat across from us at our first meeting and listened to everything we had and then said, in a voice that was professionally calm and communicated significant things beneath the calm, that what we were describing, if documented as thoroughly as we appeared to have documented it, was going to make a significant amount of noise. She was not wrong. I'm going to be careful here about what I describe in detail, both because some of it is still in legal process and because I agree to certain parameters as part of the regulatory filing. What I can tell you is the shape of it. The complaint was filed. The SEC does not announce investigations publicly when they begin, so there was a period, about 6 weeks, where nothing visible happened and I was living on savings that were shrinking and a part-time bookkeeping job I had picked up to cover my rent, and Sandra was still going into the office every day and performing normalcy with a commitment that I found both impressive and exhausting to witness from the outside. Then things started to happen that were visible. Auditors appeared. Not the internal kind. External. Federal. They arrived with the specific authority of people who do not need to explain their presence and do not require permission to access files, and they set up in a conference room, and the floor that had watched me get fired on my first day now watched federal auditors work through its financial records with the particular silence of people who are doing the math on their own exposure and what it adds up to. Marcus Hale, I am told, because I was not there, arrived on the third morning of the audit to find Rachel at her desk doing her job and Sandra at her desk doing her job and a conference room full of federal auditors doing their job, and the assistant who had replaced me in the compliance role, who had been hired specifically because she had narrower access and fewer questions, standing in the kitchen looking at her phone in the way people look at their phones when they need to appear occupied. He went into his glass corner office. He was in there for a while. Then he came out and spoke to his attorney on his cell phone in the stairwell, which he apparently believed was private, and which was not private in the way he believed because Rachel's desk was adjacent to the stairwell door and she has excellent hearing. What followed took months and I am not going to compress it into a paragraph because compression would make it feel more cinematic than it was. It was legal process. It was documentation and depositions and attorneys and regulatory procedures that move at the speed of institutions rather than the speed of drama. It was me sitting in Patricia's office multiple times explaining what I knew and how I knew it and why I had been positioned to know it, which always circled back to the same answer, because Marcus Hale had looked at me across a room on my first day and decided I was dangerous and removed me before I could prove him right from the inside, and in doing so had placed me on the outside with full knowledge and no reason to protect him. The SEC whistleblower program has a provision. When a successful enforcement action results in sanctions over a certain threshold, the whistleblowers who provided original information are entitled to a percentage. I did not file the complaint for this reason. I want to be honest about that, not because I need you to think well of me but because I think the distinction is real. I filed it because what Marcus had done was theft and his clients were real people who had trusted him with real money and that trust had been used as a mechanism of extraction, and because Rachel was 24 years old and frightened and had done the right thing by taking that screenshot and she deserved to not do the right thing alone. But the provision exists. And the sanctions cross the threshold. Patricia called me on a Tuesday, almost exactly 14 months after my first Tuesday, and told me the amount. I sat down on the floor of my apartment, not dramatically, just because I needed to be lower than standing, and I looked at the succulent on my windowsill that had survived all of this with complete botanical indifference, and I stayed on the floor for a while. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, the way she always answered, with her name like a question, and I told her I had something to tell her and she said okay and I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Say it again." I said it again. She made a sound I had not heard her make before. Then she said, "Your grandmother always said you were the kind of person things worked out for." I said, "She never met Marcus Hale." My mother laughed. The laugh went on for a while and then it shifted into something else and I listened to her move through it on the phone and I did not rush her. Sandra received her portion. Rachel received hers. Patricia took her percentage and earned every dollar of it, and the three of us went to dinner at a restaurant that none of us would have gone to before any of this happened, and we sat there for 4 hours and nobody brought up Marcus Hale once, which felt like the right way to spend the evening. Marcus Hale pleaded in a proceeding I did not attend because I did not need to. His clients received restitution from the enforcement action, not whole, not entirely, but significantly. Hale Financial Consulting no longer exists, which is the most accurate summary of where a company ends up when its founder has been skimming client funds for a minimum of 3 years and a federal regulatory body has had 14 months to document it. I have a different job now. A better one. Compliance and fraud detection at a firm that hired me specifically because of what is now on my professional record, which is the story of someone who identified a significant financial fraud and had the documentation and the nerve to do something about it. Patricia told me once that the industry talks, that what I did has a particular reputation in a specific professional community, and that reputation opens doors. She was right. The doors have been opening. I think about my first days still. Not with anger, the anger has done its work and I have released it. I think about it with the specific wonder of someone examining a pivot point. The thing that was supposed to end something was the thing that started it. He fired me to close a window and he opened the situation completely. He looked across a room full of people and made a decision about me based entirely on what I might find and what I might do with it, and he was correct about both things, and the correctness of his fear was the only mistake he actually made. He had hired me. The hiring was fine. Plenty of people have been hired into positions they do not stay in for long and the world keeps turning. He fired me the way he did. That was the mistake. Publicly, visibly, in front of Sandra, without a stated reason, on the first morning, before I had learned anything except where the coffee machine was. He lit the match himself and handed it to the one person in the room who was trained to know exactly what it was for. I replaced the succulent eventually. The original one survived 14 months on a windowsill while my entire professional life detonated and rebuilt itself, and I kept it until it was genuinely time to get a bigger pot, which felt like the right metaphor for where things had ended up, and then I repotted it and gave it more room, and it is doing fine. I am doing fine. Not in the way people say fine when they mean the opposite. In the actual way. In the way where the math of my life is working in the direction I always understood it was supposed to work, the direction my mother cleaned office buildings to point me toward, the direction Marcus Hale spent one Tuesday morning trying to close off, the direction that turned out to be exactly where I was already headed before he learned my name. He never did learn my name, by the way. I know his. That has turned out to be the more useful arrangement.